Thank you so much. That was really stunning. Wonderful reading. I think we have some time for some conversation if people want to throw some questions out for us. And maybe I'll start with, because I couldn't help but think that there was, Keisha Schlegel gave a wonderful talk today about Adrienne Rich's quote about writing out of our times, like, so confronting our times as a way to try to imagine moving past. And the Keisha's talk was really about sort of, whether what we do if we can't quite face our times, how do we work our way around it? And I think a lot of us are facing questions like that over the last year in particular. And I wonder what either of you are feeling about it, because you both deal with some pretty serious questions of our times. Thinking about the last year or so, has it changed you, like your strategies of dealing with some of these issues?
There are poems that I wrote, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, even when, like Tamir Rice or Michael Brown were killed. And, I remember like 2 years ago, I thought, hey, well, maybe we've like turned a corner on that conversation. And, maybe poems like wouldn't necessarily like address wherever we are, and sometimes it feels like, if you throw a ball in the air and you stand still and forget about it, it's going to hit you in the forehead. And, it's frustrating, obviously, that like we can't sidestep certain conversations. But then I think human beings have had the same conversation for the last, 2,000 or 3,000 years. Like it's all, greed and lust and envy, just kind of those Old Testament truths, I guess. So I don't know. I mean, Curtis, what do you think?
Well, I agree, and I would just add to that we're just a part of it. Right? We're part of the world, a part of the suffering that goes on around the world in this country. When I was reading Border Selfie, I was thinking that I should have talked about where that was written from, right? I mean, that was written about the southern border of Spain, but it could be the southern border of the United States. It could be the southern border of a lot of countries, right? I mean, just that idea of when are we ever going to get over this idea of, people being illegal, right? That is an issue, or I mean, it's one of these things that how do we continue to talk about this? What else can we do but talk about it? And I'm that line, the first line of Smokey, the most dangerous men sing, was a love song. I mean, that you think about that of those who are the most dangerous still love. Those who cause the most pain have mothers and children, possibly, right? So what is it about humanity that allows such terror and horror? I mean, this is what I'm trying to figure out, and it's like, it's still there. I don't know. This is the only way, right?
Yeah, I mean, romance, nostalgia, violence is profoundly, wedded to these things. So I mean, there's real value like in that in terms of like remembering the past, but what people are capable of to like hold on to a complicated narrative, it's visible obviously like in our politics and like the way we interact. So it's tough.
Amaud, there's a question here for you. Rebecca notes that your first two books were grounded in historical archives, and she wondered if your process was different for this book.
It was, I think, like I mentioned this kind of in some of the banter, but thinking about like the history of sound, so, what does it mean for like a voice to change? I'm thinking about that obviously in terms of like my own voice, changing over time, and, trying to capture like a sensibility that isn't, you know, factual, like in the same way, that it didn't have a kind of historical timeline. But I was thinking a great deal about the uh, the early 1970s, kind of that period after the Black Arts, Black Power movement, but before places like Compton and DC and Detroit, like kind of profoundly changed. Maybe before Reaganomics and like the drug gang epidemic kind of transformed these spaces. So there's something about the syrupiness of the music during that era that I was really focused on. So there is a thread of history to it, but it's just doing a different kind of work.
There's another question here about rituals, and this goes back to the question of dealing with difficult matters. It says, what rituals do you have to keep yourselves emotionally safe as you delve into painful terrain?
It's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that for me, writing, the best writing is the one that challenges me. And when I start to get to something that makes me feel uncomfortable, there's what I ask myself, what is that? And why am I uncomfortable with it? And I don't know I guess I don't really think about being safe. I think I've got the safety of the conversation that I have, right? I'm open to having this conversation on the page, and if I feel like I can't have it with someone, I'm not going to show that poem to them. And but usually I do. What surprises me is sometimes poems that I've written in the past, and I don't know what you have to say about this or not, but poems written in the past affect me differently in the present, right? I was telling my wife earlier that I was reading this poem, thinking about reading a poem tonight, and suddenly I got really teary. And it had nothing to do, initially, it had nothing to do with Jean Valentine, but it made me think of Jean Valentine. And maybe there are these moments or these openings that and that's the great thing about poetry, maybe, about art, where it allows for a different understanding of it at a different time. So I don't know if I answered that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember having this conversation last year with one of my grad students, and she was talking about how she was being triggered by her own work. That she was trying to finish a project. She had like a subject, something she's working through, but it was too much, right? Like revisiting questions, and she couldn't figure out the strategy to like write the thing that she wanted to take on. And what I realized in my own work, and this goes back to Rebecca's question, I was writing about history in some ways to avoid or create like a buffer, like for myself. So I was kind of using historical figures, metaphorically. I was always writing about Compton. I was always writing about, cruelty and the violence that I experienced, growing up. But like I couldn't go, I didn't know how to do that directly. So the ways that I was like researching cruelty in the past, right? Like, so like what is like a larger narrative of like aggression and violence like in this country? But then that felt like I was kind of putting on a mask. So then on my second book, I'm writing about minstrelsy, because I'm self-aware that like, oh, like I'm using history as a mask, but I didn't know how to take that mask off. So then it was like a series of masks, right? Like I'm aware that I'm wearing a mask, and I'm aware that I'm kind of playing to different audiences, you know, so it's like, you know, there's the eye that's pointing inward, and then there's the eye directed, you know, outward, you know. So then the poem became, you know, a strange kind of performative piece, you know, so it's like I'm laughing at myself, and I'm also laughing, you know, at the reader, the listener, you know, so I'm complicit like in the complication. And something happened here, you know, when you write in the eye, it's like you can't dress up the verb in the same way, right? Like you can't, it's very difficult to do anything, you know, theatric, you know, if you're writing in the first person. There's a kind of directness, a kind of brutal honesty that the first person, you know, kind of forces you, funnels you into. And yeah, it's, you have to make sure that you know, I write my journal, you know, there's work that is like doing the emotional work, you know, of just kind of getting it out. And then there's the craft-based, craft-oriented work, you know, that may become a poem. And I think I've also, it's just really happened in this last year, is I'm trying to cultivate space for personal essays as a way of kind of doing the things that are not, like, how do you make your body like an art piece? How do you make your consciousness an art piece? Those things, to a certain extent, can be problems in terms of the kind of choices you have to make a good poem, to write a good poem. And everything in your life can't be at the service, or to the service of poetry. So you have to create other spaces for, you know, communication and community building. You know, but it's difficult. I'm not gonna lie. Like it's, you know, I'm still trying to figure that out.
Someone else just put a question here. Let's see. You both challenge your readers to enter other dimensions. Amaud, you talked about Black dystopia. Philosopher Kyle White describes the present as a utopia of a settler colonial past at the same time that indigenous peoples entered a dystopia 500 years ago. And Curtis, you challenge us to consider multilinguality, even in poems you write in English only. Curtis, could you say more about the impact of Spanish on your poetry, and or how you present border selfie on the page?
Yeah, just language, kind of how the impact of the Spanish language is that it's made my English much, it's made my understanding of, let me rephrase that. It's made me speak English differently, and it's made me think in English differently. So I question much more than I ever did when I was monolingual. And whether monolingual actually exists or not, you know, we can debate that. But where I thought I was only speaking one language. So whether I'm writing in English or translating from Spanish into English, there's an attention to sound, to syntax, to you know, the verb that I didn't have before, that I'm glad that I've got now. And when I think of, you know, how that poem, you know, American selfie appears on the, or American selfie, border selfie. Can you see that come up?
Yeah.
How that appears on the page, you know, to think of, I mean, this is a reflection of a particular process that I practice when I translate, where I give myself lots of options. And so in composition, I think even in poems, we're thinking about, you know, how does something sound? And, you know, the more practiced we become, maybe we're putting fewer of those options on the page. But as a translator, I like to think of, you know, how can a particular word, what are the different iterations of it, or different incarnations? And so there I'm taking them away, but here, you know, putting them all into, you know, this is one word from Spanish that has all of these different meanings. Well, you know, I mean, to think of a word that can have the attitude, outlook, animus, mindset, posture, carriage, theatrical manner, you know, I find that fascinating. And I think that that's a, you know, this is what one of the joys of writing poems, and what language offers us, that, you know, they're just making the choice.
There's a question in the chat here that wonders what you think of the Stéphane Mallarmé quote that poetry is the language of the state of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, the way we talk about or think about negative capability, you know, that like we exist in, you know, uncertainties, like, you know, we kind of pull back from like reaching for facts. It's like the way we live right now. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen next week. You know, I think I don't want to say crisis is like a choice, you know, but like, I think like we're either always like in a crisis or we're not, you know. So like the way you feel is if you are like kind of spiraling, like in the feeling in the poem, it's like, are you spiraling down, you know, to like a crash, or are you like ascending, you know? So if it's like a crisis situation, you know, it suggests a kind of chaos. But like if it's, you know, an experience of like unknowing, of like floating, of like looking for anchors, right? That we're constantly searching for anchors, you know, if it is object, if it is sound, you know, if it is idea, that sense that, you know, chaos different from crisis, for instance, right? You know, so, you know, like I'm full of like self-doubt, you know, and all of these poems are, you know, extensions of like things that I feel like I regret. You know, there's something I wanted to say, something I wish I had an opportunity to say, and that opportunity isn't present, you know, so I'm like speaking into, you know, a kind of void. I'm trying to take control over a situation, you know, when I feel helpless. And, you know, that could be thought of as like a crisis situation, but I'm not sure if that's what it is. So I kind of resist, I guess I kind of resist that, you know, as an idea, but I think that's also like state of mind or kind of personal.
I mean, I also resist it. I think of maybe it is a result of a particular crisis, and what is crisis? I mean, for me, it comes out of not knowing, of not understanding, and trying to figure something out. So not knowing, maybe that's a crisis, but I kind of like that, right? I mean, this is what life is. We don't know answers. We don't know the answers to everything, and we discover them. And you know, I think on the page, I arrive at an understanding of something through a process. And I mean, that for me is more of what poetry is, that process, and arriving at, I guess, lessons.
I don't see other questions. I think you've both given us a lot to think about. And so we can also continue this conversation in the morning. And so why don't we wrap up, and we'll sit on this and talk some more with Amaud in the morning. Thank you both so much for being here and reading and talking tonight. It's just been fabulous. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thanks everyone for being here. Come join us for more events over the next week.